2:30. So that means the first seminar group will be from 3 to 4:30, and the second seminar group will be 4:30 to 6. Sorry about that. I know it's not ideal to finish that late, and let me know if any of you from the second seminar group absolutely can't do that later time. We can move you into the first group just for that week, and we'll figure it out. But broadly, is everyone clear on that? And then the final thing I wanted to do was take us through the presentations and just check that everyone knows what you're doing. Zainab, you said you can't do week 7, right? You can or can't?
The one on patriarchy, yes.
Sorry?
The week on
yes.
patriarchy. I can do it.
Oh, you can?
Yes.
Okay, so then we'll keep that to week 7. Okay, I can't change this. Okay, so then you're still doing week 7, and Vivian, you're doing week 8 then. If that's okay. Yeah, she was okay. Yeah, you said she's gonna be there. I'll let her know at the seminar. Okay, so then you continue with it. Sorry?
I was also supposed to do mine at week 7.
There. We'll move down to you are week 7, that's right. Yeah?
Mine is week 8,
yours is week 8 as well. Yeah? So everyone broadly knows what they're doing. We can again go over this during the seminars. I'll remind you each week. I'll check that you know whoever's doing it the next week. And I can go from there. Okay, brilliant. Now try and put this on. We start the lecture. How did you find the? Hi, I haven't met you so far. Hi, Manuel.
Starting today.
Brilliant, welcome. I'm Priya, by the way, and I'm Priya. I'll be doing all the seminars for TAG and this lecture, and then I'll also be doing rights along with Tessa. Good to meet you. Okay. So we're gonna get started with what we're doing today. It's quite a bit as always, as we have to cover in the lecture. And so today's lecture is broadly structured in 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to start with a recap in terms of, continuing this tour de force across all of the different strands of feminist thought from different parts of the world that we've been looking at, and locate today's interventions alongside them. So I'm going to trace what are some of the shared premises and the points of departure that these anti-colonial and southern feminisms emerge from, and locate it vis-a-vis the other schools of feminist thought we've been looking at. And in this section, I'm also going to try and set the stage in terms of understanding colonialism itself conceptually, and making the case for why it is important to attend to and think about the colonial encounter as centered in terms of understanding contemporary hierarchies of race and gender. Then we're going to, in the second section, look at 2 of the major threads of anti-colonial feminism. So that's post-colonial and decolonial feminisms. And you'll see that while they have a lot in common in terms of the political project that animates them, both of these emerged in very different parts of the world, responding to different types of colonial encounters and aftermaths. And they also spoke to slightly different academic traditions. So we're going to trace these antecedents and look at exactly what these interventions pose. And in the final section, we're going to look at this umbrella category of Southern feminisms, and finally look at the implications of everything that we've spoken about so far for the study and practice of gender and development. So first, just reflecting on our TAG journey so far, we've learned about a range of feminist schools of thought, from liberal feminism, Marxist and socialist feminism, radical feminisms, and finally last week, we also looked at postmodern and minority feminisms. Our session today actually shares a good number of premises with what we read about in postmodern and minority feminisms. And some of these, hi Nahaka, come on in. Problem. So some of the shared sort of premises and commitments that anti-colonial feminisms have is first that they're really interested in attending to questions of power and knowledge, and see discourse as a key site through which power and knowledge is transmitted, right? So the discursive is that main site of study and intervention in a lot of ways. And much like minority feminisms, post-colonial and decolonial feminisms also take issue with a lot of the elements of what has come to be seen as mainstream feminism. And this is especially Eurocentric forms of feminism and Eurocentric assumptions around the ways in which feminist knowledge is produced, authorized, and circulated, assumptions around who the subject of a feminist politics is, what she looks like, where she's located, what her aspirations are, what her material constraints are, etc. Another element they have in common is that anti-colonial feminisms are very interested in deconstructing, interrogating, and breaking apart constitutive binaries, such as black and white, culture, nature, man, woman, north, south, etc. So a lot of what we're going to do today is persistently interrogate a lot of the binary ways in which especially Eurocentric thinking constructs reality. And the other shared premise, especially with postmodernism, is this rejection of linear progress narratives, of grand theories of how progress can be attained and take everyone along in terms of this linear teleological path towards development. And similarly, there's also quite antagonism or skepticism towards universalisms and essentialisms. So as you've already seen in the readings, a big part of what especially Mohanty and postcolonial feminism does is interrogate this category of woman and its universal production and recirculation. So against this backdrop of where we're coming from and moving to, before we enter a conversation on what colonialism exactly is and why we must study it, I want to take up the question of why you think it's important to attend to the colonial encounter. Because I suppose in a lot of sort of common circulations, the idea is that colonialism is now a relic of the past. We are now in the post-colonial era in a sense that it is something that we have left behind, right? So do you have any quick responses in terms of why do you think it is important for the study of gender and development to think about and against the backdrop of colonialism or the colonial encounter? Go ahead, Hiba.
I think until now we are facing some gender gaps and gender problems, which goes back to the colonialism. So the colonial era has caused so many problems that we're still suffering until now, and their effects are still unsolved in so many countries, especially the third world countries.
Do you want to give an example of what one of these enduring effects of colonial gender relations could be?
Sorry?
Do you have an example of what are these effects of these colonial effects that we're still grappling with?
For example, the Western ways of solving some of the gender issues in third world countries. So, for example, we still think that the Western solutions are solutions for everything, and they assume that they also treat women or any group of concern when we want to solve any gender problems. They consider them as victims, and this has to do with the colonialist point of view and way of thinking about these countries.
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Nora.
For me personally, it is really important to go deeply into this concept because of rational impact, of course, on us. And first time when I heard about decolonial feminism, it was exactly from Russian feminists. I think it is currently now, they have a huge a movement against Russian influence because it is one of the biggest colonizator countries as currently in the world. I think.
Absolutely, with an ongoing occupation.
Yes, and maybe at the beginning of our independence, like back in 19th, early 19th, yes, I think that there was understanding of globalization, like it is something kind of really good and have a very positive impact. But now I see that it has very close linkage with all this.
Absolutely. So that's also a really important point, and Mohanty helps us think about globalization within this backdrop of colonialism and as a continuity of colonialism in a lot of ways. Go ahead.
And also, I mean, it's bizarre that we say that we are in a post-colonial era because we are not. And I think it's very important to study colonial feminism also in terms of our own colonial history. For example, India is still a colonizer. India is a colonizer in Kashmir. And that's something that we can never talk about. Or India being doing what they're doing to the African countries. And I think it's very important because it is still an ongoing process, just in most forms of history.
Absolutely. And that's precisely, again, a starting premise for both post-colonial and decolonial feminisms, that colonialism is not some distant relic of an ancient past. It is a dynamic, a relation that is fundamentally structuring our contemporary realities. And this starts from what Gayatri Spivak has typified as colonial relations being motivated or justified on the basis of white men saving brown women from brown men. And this is a quote from her sort of, epochal piece, Can the Subaltern Speak, which we'll hear about in the presentations and also go into in our seminar discussions. But what a lot of anti-colonial feminists say is that historical colonialism as well as ongoing imperialisms are constantly justified on the basis of rescuing the brown woman or rescuing the especially oppressed now in the contemporary reality Muslim woman from Islamic patriarchies, for instance. Go ahead.
Sometimes it's not just white men saving, sometimes it's white women saving brown women.
Absolutely. Increasingly so. That's an excellent point because, for instance, Laura Bush's justification of the invasion of Afghanistan was to save Afghani women from the veil and from Islamic patriarchies, right? And so there is precisely this justification of wars that we have, occupations and wars that we have seen over the past few decades, which are very much part of our contemporary realities, in the name of protecting the oppressed third world woman. And of course, there's also the irony of the fact that Barack Obama was awarded the Peace Prize in the very year that the US had the highest number of air raids across the world. I think they dropped about 26,000 bombs across 7 countries in the year that Obama was awarded the Peace Prize, right? And the street is also just an illustration of this idea that liberation, and especially feminist liberation, can be delivered especially to the Muslim world via bombs and air raids and guns. So basically the centrality of gender to imperial relations and to colonialism is that the victimized third world woman is still seen as that mobilizing and justificatory basis for Western imperialisms. And so this is something that you've seen in the Chandra Mohanty reading, where she says the dominant Western feminist represents the third world woman as leading this essentially truncated life in need of protection and emancipation from, as you said, quite often, white Western women. It is delivered by white Western women. Ratna Kapoor has similarly argued that this figure of the third world woman is based on a range of various gender and cultural essentialisms, where both the category of woman as well as the category of third world, whether that's Indian or Pakistani or Middle Eastern, all of these cultures are produced in an entirely homogeneous and flattened way. So it's really important to attend to questions of colonialism, because the ways in which dominant gender categories are constructed and mobilized for political projects have huge implications for contemporary global hierarchies. And aside from the figure of the victimized third world woman as being seen to invite imperial protection, increasingly questions of sexual liberation have also become a battling ground for global imperialism. So this is something we'll be talking about a little bit in our rights lecture as well. But Jasveer Puar, for instance, coined the term homo-nationalism to describe the sort of favorable association between nationalist and ethno-nationalist ideologies and LGBT people and their rights. So, for instance, Israel has engaged in what Jasveer Puar and others call pink washing, which is a sort of celebration of their own ostensibly progressive views towards sexuality as justification for the occupation of Palestine, which is supposed to be not quite as progressive in their treatment of sexual minorities. And this completely erases Israel's own complicity in the sort of occupation and death of thousands of Palestinians, including sexual minorities. And similarly, in India, the ongoing occupation of Jammu and Kashmir is often justified on the basis of saving Kashmir ki kalis, these sort of delicate flowers of our north that are at risk of radicalization and oppression from their Muslim men. and the liberation will, of course, be delivered by the Indian army, often through mass rape with impunity, as we've seen in places like Kunan and Poshpora. And of course, this idea of homo-nationalism about mobilizing sexuality and sexual permissibility as a tool to justify imperialism is something that's also been deployed in the context of Jammu and Kashmir in India. Because, for instance, a few years ago, the Indian courts decriminalized homosexuality. And that again then became a basis to justify the ongoing occupation of Kashmir, saying, look at how progressive we are, and we need to be able to carry these progressive ethos to these territories that we are currently occupying. So before we go into understanding the ways in which the colonial encounter continues to construct race and gender as categories and ossify racial and gendered hierarchies, we're going to spend a minute now trying to understand exactly what it is we mean by colonialism. Because, of course, in different contexts, this is a term that's used to refer to a whole range of phenomenon. But at its very core, colonialism is essentially a relation of structural domination, often by an external power, that is secured and maintained both through the use of force as well as through ideological impositions. And it is these ideological impositions that we're going to be taking apart carefully today. So if you look at Mohanty's characterization of colonialism and colonization, you've heard how she provides accounts for how the term has been used by in different traditions, right? So, for example, Marxists and structuralists see colonization as a mode of exploitative economic exchange. To Black feminists, it is a process of the appropriation of Black experiences, struggles, and knowledges. But in her own work, Chandra Mohanty sees colonization as a practice of the suppression or erasure of the heterogeneity of colonized subjects. It is this forced essentialism or enforced homogeneity of especially colonized women. So basically, across all of these, the main thing to remember is to think of colonialism as necessarily a relation of domination, and that the ideological construction that props up colonialism is often this notion of a Western superiority, or of a constructed superiority that is juxtaposed against the backwards, naive ways of the indigenous other. Now, a sterling example of this sort of construction of Western superiority lies in what's called Macaulay's Minute on Education. So Thomas Babington Macaulay was a British politician who introduced a treatise on why there should be English language education in the colonies. This was in 1835, and he was sort of arguing in the Parliament for a definitive reason for why the East India Company in India at that point had a duty to educate indigenous citizens, and why there was actually the sort of imperial burden of the promotion of European learning. And it's a startling quote, actually. So I'm going to read this out to you. So Macaulay says that I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, and this is very clear. But I have done what I could to form a correct estimate of their value. I've read translations of the most celebrated Arabic and Sanskrit works. I've conversed both here and at home with men distinguished by their proficiency in the Eastern tongues. I'm quite ready to take the Oriental learning at the valuation of the Orientalists themselves. I have never found one among them who can deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is indeed fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental Plan of Education. And this Oriental Plan of Education was basically to halt indigenous forms of learning and language circulation, etc., and impose European ways of knowing. And unfortunately, this Macaulay's Minute on Education was not a fringe or exceptional view held by one highly extreme politician within the imperial governing elite. This was very much what there was a good deal of consensus about. It was very representative of the dominant ideological construction of the Orient through the practice of what Edward Said has called Orientalism. And Macaulay's Minute on Education passed, by the way, in 1835 and then became colonial policy. So how many of you have heard of the term Orientalism? Is that something, does any of you want to tell us a little about your understanding of it? Go ahead.
So basically the idea that in a hierarchy it's like the West and the rest, and Western ideology and Western ways of living are seen as like the superior way of living, and the countries that are in the rest, which the Orient that Saeed talks about is like the East, and is sort of saying that where the West is educated and rational beings, the East or West are uneducated, they are irrational, like they need to learn from the Western culture and ideologies. So it's basically like a hierarchy holding Western culture.
Absolutely. That's it. Does anyone have anything to add to that? Go ahead.
I know Orientalism in a different way from my context. For us, Orientalism or Orientalist are these Westerners who would come to our country, learn our language, and start living in the desert. They really exaggerate to a level that we don't even do.
Yeah.
And most of the times, historically, Orientalists were considered to be spies from the West who were sent to our countries in order to sabotage the social traditions and social, traditions and trends. And they were also sent to do and cause some internal disputes and achieve some external agendas.
Yeah.
That's how I know it.
Which is very interesting, because you're absolutely right, because there's also this connotation of Orientalists as those who fetishize Eastern cultures, who, even if it is a sort of admiration for it, it is still this idea of them as distinct, as a completely exotic and distinct body of people and knowledge that they generate. So as all of you have, as both of you have fed in basically to Saeed, Orientalism is now increasingly actually a field of study. It has become an academic discipline in its own right in a lot of ways, but it's at its core a worldview based on the hierarchical distinction between the Orient, which at that time when Saeed was writing, was referring to parts of especially North Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and the Occident, which was mostly Europe, the colonizing forces. And to Saeed, Orientalism, or these forms of hierarchical knowledge production, was a powerful tool of domination, because it became again a justification for ongoing occupation, as well as the tool through which that control was secured and maintained. Because Orientalism also then involved the training of a cadre of local elites in the language and governing technologies of the colonies, right? So importantly, though, Orientalism again is not some sort of distant relic of a now vanquished past, and there were very systematic steps taken to make sure that Orientalism and its effects remained pervasive. So scholars like Charles Mills, Stuart Hall, Anne Stoller, and others have spoken about processes that they variously call white ignorance, white innocence, colonial amnesia, colonial aphasia, or unknowing, which are all contemporary modes of Western knowledge production that continue to engage in the willful erasure or obscuring of colonial histories and their material and epistemic continuities, right? So while there was not only the sort of complete denial of the existence of legitimate forms of knowledge within the colonies, there's also then this ongoing project of erasing those histories of legitimate knowledge that existed before colonial occupation, and moves to what again, Stuart Mill, for instance, calls white innocence. Tuck and Yang have called settler moves to innocence, where you claim an ignorance of those systematic efforts that you made to erase forms of local knowledge production. And those erasures are, for instance, Gayatri Spivak calls it epistemicide, which is the mass sort of killing off or annihilation of local ways of knowing and circulating knowledge. And part of how white innocence or colonial aphasia or amnesia is secured is through things like the school curriculum in the UK right now, where so little is taught about colonialism, especially its deeply damaging effects. And of course, these practices of white innocence or white ignorance are also not exclusively limited to white subjects. I just want to take a minute to watch this if it works. Let's see. I don't know. Why am I not able to open it? Let me just try and... Oh. No. Okay, I'm just going to try and find it. Do you all know who Suella Braverman is?
I don't.
Does anyone know? Oh, gosh. Does anyone remember who Suella is? Well, she was very blink and miss. She was under Liz Truss, very briefly. She was the sort of Home Secretary for... Yeah. I mean, it lasted all of 2 minutes. But here you go. So this is what she had to say about empire. And Suella Braverman...
The fashion wars. And then
the Tory party, as you know, has a long history of... and one of the most contemporary forms of colonialism is through the imposition of borders, right? Where, you know, and of course, those of you who've been here for a while know of the Windrush scandal that was playing out over the past 5-6 years, where I think one of the most heartbreaking, enduring effects of colonialism is the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people every year in the Mediterranean, where colonialism or where empire has suddenly decided to close its boundaries to those that they previously considered their own subjects. And that's precisely what has precipitated various forms of migrant crises and refugee crises all over the world. And the Tory government in the UK has been drawing harsher and harsher lines around its boundaries. And, you know, the production of fortress Europe and militarized border regimes is very much a manifestation of contemporary coloniality. And a lot of this is done through an absolute denial of precisely the conditions of what colonialism was and what implications that has for former colonies.
memorable trip to Paris. Now I'm using Vinted to get some money back from them.
Can I ask a personal question? Your parents are from Mauritius and Kenya. How do you feel about stopping other people arriving here?
I have no qualms about that. Absolutely, I don't. And again, this is a kind of a common argument trotted out by the left that, you know, because of the colour of my skin and my heritage, I have to think a certain way and I can't declare certain truths.
You annoy them, don't you? Because you're not left wing.
I hope I annoy them. That would be my delight if I'm annoying the left. But no, I disagree with that. My parents came here through safe and legal routes. My mother was recruited by the NHS. My dad came here because he was effectively kicked out of Kenya in the 1960s. But they came here legitimately. That was the policy of the government. They came here, they integrated, they love this country from afar as children of empire. They don't, by the way, have any qualms about extolling the virtues of the British Empire. It was the British Empire that brought infrastructure, the legal system, the civil service, the military to countries like Mauritius and Kenya. And my parents are so proud. On my mum's side there, I think it's her great uncle and auntie fought with the Allies in World War II, and they're so proud of that. So I think, you know, children of empire, there are definitely, there's obviously a mixed picture, and obviously there are bad things about empire, but
History is complex.
History is complex and nuanced, and I'm not going to apologise for empire. I'm not going to apologise for our past history.
Should we be proud of empire? Should we be proud of it?
I am proud of the British Empire.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Yeah, she's clearly proud of the British Empire. And I like how she says that, oh, my parents came here through legal routes, and she's changing the law to make sure no one else can come through legal routes. And that's precisely what the Tory party has done. And it's quite funny because the Tories in particular have been very good at anointing this model minority brown woman to speak on behalf of empire and closing about borders for a long... Sorry?
I was just saying, it just reminds me of Kemi Badenoch, the other Nigerian woman that was also at a point contesting for the prime minister.
Right.
And everything she always says about like Nigeria, saying bad things about Nigeria, now colonialism and whatnot, in quotes, Nigeria up to now is not developed or modernized to an extent, and how that is a campaign strategy just annoys me.
Yeah.
What you said about they always find a way to place someone that is supposed to be our person to be there and just mess up everything.
Yeah, this is exactly the sort of logic of the model minority, you know. Find that grateful native who benefited from colonialism and got economic and other forms of mobility through it and is able to make the case for you. And Preeti Patel was that for the Tory party for a long time, and now briefly we had Suella, and now God knows what's happening. We don't have a prime minister, but we'll find out in the next few days. And it does.
Also victims of the colonialism themselves, because you know them having to speak this way is also another way to find the way through. Yes, to navigate,
it's like a survival kind of.
To try to be presented, to be seen, and that's why they're saying so. Maybe I'm just like trying to understand this from another way because I feel bad for them. I mean,
that's very generous. Yeah.
I feel bad for her having to speak like this in order to be seen on YouTube by class of gender.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think that, again, there's many accounts for it. The traditional Marxist account for why someone would say that is false consciousness, the internalization of dominant ideologies. But there's also the reality, and it's a difficult one to contend with, that actually colonialism had very mixed effects for colonized subjects. There are a lot of local elites who benefited tremendously by cozying up to or becoming colonial administrators, etc. Right? So it is a checkered and complex history, and certainly not one that was, again, homogeneous in its effects. So there's certainly families, populations that benefited from it and continue to. And then quite often it's these model minorities who make their way into positions of power and dominance and are quite happy to shut the door behind them, which is precisely what we see happening here. Before we go on to the sort of specific schools of anti-colonial feminist thought, I want to quickly foreshadow the notion of the colonial construction of race and gender. There's especially the work of two brilliant social anthropologists, Anne McClintock and Anne Stoller, are of particular importance. Both of them identified race and gender as central colonial sorting techniques and showed how the control of racialized and gendered bodies and relations was central to colonial governance, right? And what was really important about a lot of their work is that they denaturalized these categories of race and gender. They said that these aren't actually pre-existing social or biological facts that the imperialists just came, identified, and named. Racialization and gendering to them were actual active political processes. The construction of race and the construction and imposition of gender were not simply like exercises in classification of pre-existing difference. It was a construction of difference, a construction and naming and enforcing of difference. And importantly, both McClintock and Stoller insist that we think of both race and gender together as co-constitutive dynamics. And they asked us to examine the simultaneous and related colonial production of both. So McClintock, in her book called Imperial Leather, which is a brilliant sort of anti-colonial account that I would strongly recommend reading, she says, and I quote, "Race, gender, and class are not distinct realms of experience existing in splendid isolation from each other, nor can they be simply yoked together retrospectively, like armatures of Lego. Rather, they came into existence in and through relation to each other, even if in often contradictory and conflicted ways." Right? So this is basically a a strong endorsement of thinking intersectionally. And not thinking intersectionally in terms of, okay, let's think of race, and then we add gender and we add class as separate and distinct dynamics, but see how each of these are involved in producing one another. That the figure of the black woman does not come simply through the addition of class to race to gender, but through a very particular and complex interaction between these different dynamics. So, importantly for these theorists, imperialism was not something that happened, elsewhere, a disagreeable fact of history that now the white Western world needs to in some way face up to, but that the white Western world or Europe was actually produced in itself through the production of alterity. You need the other in order to be able to arrive at a coherent idea or image of the self. And it was precisely through colonialism that this notion of Western superiority was cemented through the production of alterity, the site of the other, which was the colony. So this is a quick sort of summary which captures the range of work done especially by historians and anthropologists on how the colonial encounter fundamentally altered gender relations with quite lasting consequences. So a lot of them have studied shifts in economic relations that come out of colonial market relations. They've examined the legal codification of family laws, land rights, and their impacts. Sangaria and Ved have done work on this. There's also the legal codification of laws governing gender and sexuality, which have long and ongoing histories in many of our parts of the world. And there was also colonial laws that intervened in relations between local patriarchal power and colonial authority. And McClintock's work is really interesting here on imperial leather. Finally, a lot of work from historians and anthropologists around the question of gender and colonialism lies in how the woman question was asked and answered in anti-colonial struggles. So in a lot of cases where colonies were struggling to overthrow imperial forces, they had to ask and answer the really important question of, okay, what do we see as the role of women within our hopeful post-colonial society? And this is where gender also really entered centrally into the frame. And Amina Mama is a really important theorist in this regard. Now, before we move on to post-colonial and decolonial feminisms, I want to give you an example and then prompt you to think of similar examples in your settings of how colonial texts and legislations and codifications produced gender and race in very specific ways. This example is of a gentleman called Norman Shevers, who was the forefather of colonial medical jurisprudence. So medical jurisprudence is basically the study of what constitutes evidence within the law. Right? So how can medicine, what sits at the junction between medicine and the law? And Norman Shevers had written a lot of books on medical jurisprudence for the West. But then when he started writing these books for colonies, he said, actually, we're dealing with a very different sort of human here. And it's the same rules of what constitutes evidence and not, and how people respond and what testimony looks like is completely different. So Shevers wrote, for instance, of the strange combination of sensuality, jealousy, wilded and ineradicable superstition, absolute untruthfulness, and ruthless disregard of the value of human life that lie below the placid, civil, timid, forbearing exterior of the native of India. Right? So there was this characterization of who is the subject that you will be encountering on trial. And it's very different from the subject that you will see in the West. It is someone who is willfully untruthful, and who's sort of entrenched in these forms of superstition. And he said that unlike English defendants, the native defendant in India has deceit as inherent to their character, and especially in the lower classes of natives. And this is what is going to surround all judicial proceedings with obscurity. It's going to become so much harder to discern truth from untruth because these people are themselves so given to lying. Now, some of these logics have then carried on into contemporary medical jurisprudence in India, because Jai Singh Modi then wrote the textbooks that inform medical jurisprudence in now independent India, and carried a lot of these assumptions. So, for instance, what Shevers had written was that, look, for a frail white woman, it's quite possible to overpower her and rape her. And a lot of these studies have to do with rape jurisprudence, right? What constitutes sufficient evidence to show that a woman has been violated. Now, according to Norman Shevers, that it's quite easy to overcome a frail white woman and impose your sexual will on her. But for native Indians, who he sees as far more hardy, as working in the fields, as also given to lying, according to Shevers, and then according to Modi, it is not possible for a single man to hold sexual intercourse with a healthy adult female in full possession of her senses against her will, unless she is taken unawares, thrown accidentally to the ground, or placed in such a position as to render her completely helpless, or unless she swoons away from fright or exhaustion. Right? So basically, the assumption here is that there have to be, and this then became codified in terms of the resistance requirement, which is that, look, for a healthy woman to claim that she has been raped, there have to be serious signs of struggle and injury on her body. And especially if she's a working class woman, we had assumed that she's strong enough to fight off any man, at least one, if it's just one man. And so we assume that any claim to rape is untrue. And so in India, until less than a decade ago, there was a practice, there were all sorts of hideous evidentiary practices. For instance, we had something called the two-finger test, which I imagine might be a colonial relic in other parts of the world as well, where the chastity of a rape victim was retrospectively checked to see how easily her vagina would admit two fingers in a medical examination. And if it easily admitted two fingers, then the assumption is that she's what is called a habituate. She's habituated to sexual intercourse. And so it's unlikely that she was withdrawing consent. It's most likely that it was consensual sex.
The two-finger test will continue in India. Yeah, even in Pakistan.
But no, after the Evidence Act, this thing, I mean, at least in the letter of the law, it's not allowed anymore. In practice, yeah, of course. Absolutely. Yeah, but I mean, in 2013, after when the criminal law amendments came, at least in the Evidence Act, it was.
A couple of years ago in Bangladesh, our High Court actually abolished this.
That's right, in Bangladesh as well. So then there's I mean, there's all of these sort of outrageous, and all of these are entirely colonial legacies and are forms of modern reinterpretations and repackagings of colonial rationalities. So take 5 minutes then to just discuss with whoever's next to you a little bit about any similar colonial laws that defined and regulated gender and sexual relations in your own context. So one example of that is the sort of criminalization of sex against the order of nature, which exists in a lot of post-colonies. And also think about what gender relations looked like prior to, during, and following colonial occupations. If there were significant shifts you see in your either the context you're from or a context you work in or are familiar with. So take a few minutes to just discuss with whoever's sitting next to you. We'll come back. Okay, shall we come back to, does anyone want to feedback on anything that you discussed? Anything, any questions, comments? Go ahead, Vidush.
Yeah, so I think we both spoke in terms of gender and sexual relations. So Manus, she's from Egypt, and I was also telling her about India, about how the trans identity, though of course it wasn't all great before the Britishers came, but it wasn't as marginalized as it is now, and it was, I mean, it was accepted that there are trans people, and they were in part of auspicious occasions like weddings and births and all of that. But now, with the whole coming of the Victorian morality and gender being defined in very binary ways, the trans identity has completely been invisibilized. So much so that now we have such draconian laws like the Protection of Trans Persons Act of 2016, which said that if you want to identify as a trans person, you have to parade naked in front of a panel who's then going to tell you if they accept that you're a trans person. And you want to talk about the gender issues?
I think before Egypt was colonized with the British and the French, we have a nice mix. I think before that, homosexuality was not that frowned upon. In Egypt, you cannot go in public and say you are gay or lesbian. So, and there are like kind of like laws that bans adultery and that are used specifically for
sexual minorities.
Yes.
Yeah.
One thing also I want to add is I'm not sure if that relates back to colonization, but when you were speaking of the two-finger test, we have something similar called the virginity test, and like women who are arrested are subjected to that. Yeah, so that they see if they are virgins or not, so that they cannot claim later on that they were raped by the police at the police station or at prison. And this is still
practice. Yeah, it's interesting in terms of tracing how many of these have roots in colonial relations. There's very interesting work by someone called Elizabeth Kolsky, who actually talks about how, while a lot of patriarchal notions and practices and ideas might have existed, of course, pre-colonialism, the medicalization of identities happened hugely through colonial rationalities, which is that somehow you can make the body speak a truth that the person will not. So, for instance, a medical check for something like virginity, the medicalization of trans identity, that it is something that a doctor or a specialist or someone can read from your body, irrespective of your speech. That was very much a colonial relic. And so Elizabeth Kolsky writes about, she has an article called The Body Evidencing the Act, which is testimony is no longer relevant because especially for native subjects who are not believed to be speaking the truth in the first place, you look at the body as a site of evidence rather than their speech. So I guess that in some ways that rationality that you're talking about does have some sort of colonial antecedent. Yeah, go ahead. Elizabeth Kolsky, I want to say Kolsky. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, do you want to, Zainab, and then? Okay.
Just to touch on the same discussion, and especially on, I think it really would get hard for me to take it that why would it be difficult to just get to hear from a woman that she's been harassed and get to believe it than taking her through several medical examinations? So I was really wanted to hear the got to do some measurements. I worked under the gender-based violence and prevention program, and for cases of defilement, yes, we would still have to take children through the medical examination, and then you have to see what you're able to tell whether the child has been penetrated or not. And but we also had cases of, well, after a lot of civilization coming in, we have cases of marital rape coming up. And yet in the African traditional society, you don't expect a woman to come up and say, my husband is raped me. What is that? What are you even saying? How does your husband get to rape you? As a woman, you're supposed to submit to give, sexual pleasure to your husband. So here we would still get to examine these women, but everybody, even in the police, is not very supportive. And still throws these negative words to the woman. And even if, well, we get to support and back up, push the case. So for it to get a hearing even in court, we have to move with a medical report from not just any medical person. It must be from a doctor or a clinical, a clinician. That yes, I've examined the person, and this is what I have noticed with ABCD witnesses. Yes, because we would have to go and witness the examination. Yeah. So then that case can proceed. So yes, it really gets puzzling about that. And
yeah, absolutely. And I think that again, the codification, I mean, a lot of the practices in both law and medicine in all of our parts of the world are also colonial legacies in a lot of ways. And a lot of them treat women of color with great suspicion. That's absolutely true. Sorry, were you going to say something, Zainab, and then we'll quickly come down? Go ahead.
America and I we spoke about how colonialism has influenced the standard of beauty before what we had, for instance, in India and also in Africa and Nigeria. And I shared the rampant, which is something that is still existent in terms of the hair and the color of your skin. So there is this perception, not a law per se, but it's colonial.
Oh yeah.
Some of the impact.
Absolutely.
Of that, and then there's this standard of beauty with the hair where it's not permed and fried and whatnot, and then to lay and whatnot, you're not seen as you're not perceived to be beautiful. There's this unrealistic standard, and more worrying for me is the skin bleaching that has become a major thing in Nigeria, because people want to, there's this notion that you're dark skinned, someone like me, you're not beautiful thereabouts. So people are going into bleaching their skin, harming themselves, whether they know the side effects or not. Because yes, you want this public affirmation of being beautiful, but also in terms of social status. And it goes as far as even job opportunities. Sometimes the standards is there, well stated, we want a light-skinned woman for this role and whatnot. And I kind of can link it to colonialism, because it's still part of, if we go way back, I think it's just there's that idea of the standard that the Western world already set, like from our readings, this idea of them being dominating and whatever they're doing has to, because if there is no that unequal power of saying I'm superior and you're inferior, then it doesn't, what makes them be the standard. So I think it's just also that, and also with the way that slaves were treated then, because I know from some movies I've watched, even if a lighter skin slave is even maybe well treated than a darker skin one, you get to maybe work indoor rather than on the field or thereabouts. So there is that there's that brainwashing, a mindset of wanting to be like the colonizer, because you already assume that that is the standard, the accepted standard of beauty. Yeah, it still continues, unfortunately.
Like it's like beauty has to be appropriated, or like features of third world or global south women have to be appropriated by a white woman for them to look good. Like when Kylie Jenner comes suddenly and she's like, oh, this hourglass figure is beautiful, but like they told us that those women can't be held down and they are ugly.
So go ahead, Niharika, and then we'll move around. Yes, go ahead.
Like in India, before we were colonized, kings like rulers and like a lot of men used to prefer healthier women, like more like curvier women, because they could bear healthy children, healthy kids. But when we got colonized, the idea of normativity, the normal body, what a normal body should look like. So like then men started preferring slimmer women who were like more as per like colonial idea, were more appealing and were more beautiful. So yeah, that's how like it was for like healthier kids, and now I just think
aesthetic. Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to add to, because I think in Egypt it's still like if you're working in a diplomatic position, like in an embassy, you cannot have like curly hair. I don't think it's accepted.
Wow.
What is accepted then? No, it's straight or plain or
wow.
This is too hippie.
Yeah. No, I think standards of beauty is important. Go ahead, Hiba.
No, I just want also to mention an example of some of the colonial laws that we still have in Syria, which is a rape perpetrator can get away from the penalty if he marries the victim. And I think so many women who are victims of rape would have to do so in order, to get away from also the social
stigma
that would be put on them. And this also applies to the rape of children. So even if the rape victims are under 17, they would have to get married to their rapist, even though this is not allowed to be the case if they are, not victims of rape. And this goes back, of course, to the French colonization of Syria. It was by Napoleon 1801, something like that.
Were you going to say something? Go ahead.
But it is still valid in
No,
Not in France, yeah.
Didn't use like since the days of Napoleon, but we still use it in Syria.
But in France,
No, it's definitely not.
Go ahead, Kashfa.
and also like in Bangladesh, we have Women and Children Repression Act.
Mm-hmm.
However, like it stated that the rape definition, like it refers to the colonial rape law, which is in penal code, and which is in 1860.
Yeah.
And the definition like actually doesn't like include the all sexual violence, including rape. And the way the definition stated, it's not only actually victimized women, however, like while the law enforcement agency, they are in the judgment table, it actually contradicts because like the young men and boys who also being raped,
There's
not
no
supported.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the definition actually, the law enforcement agency, though they have will to support the survivors, however,
can't.
the definition actually
Is not that expansive. Yeah. Yeah, so clearly there's examples from all over the world, but the similarities are quite striking in terms of, and it's the same in all of South Asia. We still use the penal code from 1860. That hasn't, I mean, bits have been reformed, but not altogether. Okay, so we're going to now move on to part 2, where we're going to do a bit more of a deep dive into 2 main threads of anti-colonial feminisms, which are post-colonial and decolonial feminisms. There's quite a bit in common between these 2, but there are also significant distinctions, as we'll see when we go through them. What they share certainly is an investment in uncovering and challenging the logics of colonial knowledge and the legacies that they leave behind, as well as the hierarchies that they've imposed and uphold. So basically, both of them take this power-knowledge nexus as a central site of intervention and study. But they developed in very different parts of the world in response to different academic traditions. So post-colonial feminisms mostly spoke to Asia, Africa, and Middle Eastern contexts. And the time that they were looking in terms of the epoch of colonialism that they were attending to was the 18th and 19th centuries, most centrally. Decolonial feminisms, on the other hand, emerged mostly in Latin America and increasingly now in North America. And they focused on earlier occupation from 16th centuries onwards. And what's also important here is that they're actually speaking to slightly distinct forms of colonial occupation, because in a lot of what post-colonial theory is speaking to, it was a form of colonial occupation that was to an extent successfully overthrown. At least there's no ongoing occupation of territory in the same sense. But decolonial feminisms, a lot of them speak to settler colonial realities, right? So where colonialism in terms of the occupation of land is an ongoing trait, like in the Americas, where colonialism is in every way an enduring dynamic. So basically, the bodies of work that we're going to discuss today, much like we've seen so far with liberal, radical Marxist feminisms, are also internally heterogeneous. So there's quite a bit of internal diversity within post-colonial feminisms and within decolonial feminisms. They're certainly not monoliths. And what they share, unfortunately, is that both remain slightly marginal within their own fields of knowledge, right? Because post-colonial feminisms and decolonial feminisms are not yet the mainstream of feminist theory as it is thought or understood. So they also share that relative marginality and in various ways speak against or in response to hegemonic and mainstream feminisms, as we'll see and as we've already seen in your reading so far. So first we're going to take up post-colonial feminisms, and I'm going to situate that more broadly within this legacy of post-colonial theory. So post-colonialism emerged as an intellectual movement that consolidated the ideas of some thinkers like Edward Said, Frantz Fanon, C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney, Homi Bhabha, some of whom you might have already heard about through our lectures and seminars so far. So post-colonial theory was firmly rooted in anti-colonial struggles and thought, and it owes much of its legacy to movements to overthrow colonial rule. And these were movements that especially unfolded in the 19th and 20th centuries. And of course, some of them were earlier, like C.L.R. James writes about the Haitian Revolution, which happened in the late 1700s. So what's important to note here also is that post-colonial theory, in terms of relating it to some of the previous schools of thought that we've looked at, builds to a huge extent on the Marxist tradition, and especially on Marxist historiography. So it isn't so much an outright rejection or displacement of Marxist theory, but in some ways a supplementation of it, because it thought that it had some major deficiencies that needed to be addressed. And post-colonial theory concerns itself with a lot of hitherto underexplored or ignored elements of social sciences, humanities, and literary theory. So, for instance, it was one of the first fields of study that took seriously questions of identity, subjectivity, subject formation, agency, representation. And in terms of its contemporary applications, it looks at questions of cosmopolitanism, migratism and refugees, asylum, migrancy, as well as a broader debate and discourse on rights and human rights. There we go. Now, what's really important in terms of thinking about the space of the post in post-colonial thinking is that it does not mean to indicate a period following and entirely unaffected by colonialism, colonial relations, and colonial arrangements of power. Right? So this post is not a straightforward after colonialism, as if there are no continuities. Instead, what it sort of tried to do was fill in the crisis that came through the emergence of the term third world. Because there was a sense that the term third world flattened a lot of differences, conflicts, and contradictions that existed within the third world. Right? So this post-colonial was a term that was introduced to thematize the issues that came out of colonial relations and their aftermath into the present. So as Spivak says, post-coloniality acquires significance not as a term that periodizes history too glibly as the pre, during, and post, but a displacement of European concept metaphors from their proper context. In the words of Gyan Prakash, who was another important post-colonial theorist, post-coloniality sidesteps the language of beginnings and ends and installs itself in the totalizing narrative of European colonialism in a way that seeks to acknowledge and undo it. Right? So it's naming the thing that we want to take apart. So again, just to remember, in any conversations in post-colonialism, it is not a study of what comes after colonialism, because it is very insistent in its recognition that this after is not a perfect break from colonialism, that there are enduring effects. So coming now to post-colonial feminisms in particular, and those of you in the first seminar group will hear a little bit about this from Amalini's presentation, which picks up on, are you doing that as well? That's you, right, you're doing it. Okay, then those of you in the second group will hear from Kshatija's presentation on Can the Subaltern Speak. Have any of you heard of Spivak's work? Do you want to tell us a little bit about it, Joanna, or whatever you know?
I didn't know Spivak's work on analyzing gender.
Mm-hmm.
It's like quite for me, because Jane Eyre has been like my favorite novel so far, but I have never paid much attention on this Rochester guy's wife. She was from colony, she was a colored woman, but she was like locked in a castle because she had a mental problem and she absolutely had no right to speak about her rights, her experience. And I think like Spivak also thinks that she is one form of solution.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that the same Can the Subaltern Speak applies to a lot of the subjects that Spivak studies. So this particular work of Spivak's try to challenge the way in which Western cultures study and investigate other cultures. So Spivak used the example of the practice of sati in India, which is widow immolation, which was a quite dominant practice in colonial India, where widows were, in some cases, forced to, in some cases, ostensibly volunteered to commit suicide by fire, but through immolation on the funeral pyre of their husband. So as their husband's, corpse was burning, they would enter the pyre, and it was a practice of widow immolation, which was to a huge extent coerced, as you can imagine, but also occasionally voluntarily undertaken. And so Spivak is looking at the colonial practice of the colonial debates around banning sati or widow immolation. And the basic claim that Gayatri Spivak makes in this work is that Western academic and all other forms of knowledge are basically produced in order to uphold Western economic interests. There is nothing innocent about these forms of knowledge. There is nothing inherently magnanimous and invested in the liberation of other parts of the world or peoples, but it is expressly in the interest of advancing Western, especially economic interests. So for Spivak, knowledge is like any other commodity that is exported from the West to the third world for financial and other forms of gain. So through this essay, Spivak is trying to work through the question of how the third world subject, this Indian woman, can be studied without complicity in the colonial project. So she points to the fact that research is in some ways always colonial, in that it always defines the other over there as an object of study rather than a subject of knowledge. And that knowledge is something that is to be extracted from that subject and brought here. No problem. So discussing the figure of the sati, or the immolated widow in colonial India, Spivak talks about how this figure is somehow torn between native patriarchies who want her to jump in the funeral pyre and colonial rescue missions who want to save her from this colonial fire. And so in this tussle between local patriarchies and colonial saviorism and superiority, the figure of the subaltern woman is systematically displaced and her own voice is irretrievably lost. So Spivak writes, between patriarchy and imperialism, subject constitution and object formation, the figure of the woman disappears, not into pristine nothingness, but into a violent shuttling that is a displaced figuration of the third world woman, caught between tradition and modernization, culturalism and development. So what Spivak is developing is what is called a representational or epistemological understanding of subalternity. She sees subalternity as that position which is radically unrepresentable, because that subject is unable to speak for or represent herself. So what's really important here is while the title of the essay is Can the Subaltern Speak?, Spivak's argument is in no way that the subaltern cannot speak or is incapable of speech, but that her voice does not register with the hegemonic ear. We are not able to hear her rather than she is not able to speak. When she speaks, her language is unintelligible to us or we are uninterested in responding to it. So the challenge for us as practitioners, scholars, etc., trying to engage with subaltern subjects is to enter into a responsible, accountable and ethical representational relationship with the subaltern subject, to develop the infrastructure with which or through which her voice can emerge and be heard. That is what Spivak's overall argument is in Can the Subaltern Speak? Mohanty's work, which you read, takes a lot of its premises from Spivak's work and is another defining post-colonial feminist text in a lot of ways. I'm not going to go into Mohanty too much because I'm hoping all of you have read and engaged with it in some depth, and we're going to pick it up again in the seminars. But as you know, basically what she's interested in doing here is also exposing power knowledge at the nexus of feminist cross-cultural scholarship and taking issue with the Eurocentric, falsely universalizing methodologies that, in her view, serve Western feminist interests through their construction of the third world woman. And so her central goal here was to try and sort of unpick these workings of how the third world woman is constructed under Western eyes as a homogeneous group where all of its members are essentially the same. And this average third world woman leads a life that is constrained by her family, by her sex, by tradition. She's ignorant of her own subjugation, completely domesticated, often uneducated and thoroughly victimized. And of course, this figure of the third world woman is produced in opposition to the Western woman, who is constructed as educated and modern with control over her bodies and her body and her life choices. So there's a range of objectives and assumptions that Mohanty takes issue with in her work. And it's something that we're going to do a little bit of a deep read into. So we're going to look at her critique of the assumption that women are this pre-existing coherent universal group, and especially the third world woman maps onto that. We're going to look at Mohanty's critiques of methodological universalism and what she means by that. And she's also asking us to look at the models of power that support these forms of academic moves and representations. What's really interesting is that Mohanty actually revisited Under Western Eyes 16 years after it was first written. So in 2002, against the backdrop of the war on terror and a changing global landscape, Mohanty goes back to this text and analyzes it against this contemporary context of escalating challenges at the turn of the 20th century, of the 21st century. And she also responds to some of the critiques and misreadings of her work. And what's important here is that actually she sort of distances herself from a purely postmodern reading. She says that I actually don't want to completely refuse the possibility of a universal politics. So she says that, look, I want to critique essentialisms, I want to critique certain forms of Western universalisms, but I think that there is also the possibility of a transnational feminist politics of solidarity. I don't want to give up on that. And that's something that we're going to again look at in our seminars and come to in the last section of the lecture today. So here's a range of other really important thinkers if you want to explore post-colonial feminist theory. There's Anya Lumba, Rajeshri Sundararajan, Laila Abu Lagod, who wrote Do Muslim Women Need Saving? Laila Abu Lagod and Saba Mahmood have written extensively about practices of veiling and about the possibility of agency within Islamic traditions. These are really important pieces of work. Amin Mama writes mostly about the African context. Jackie Alexander also writes about Caribbean context, among several others. So let me know if there's any of these authors or texts that you're interested in. I'll be happy to chat about them. Now, as a last sort of touch point on post-colonial feminisms, there are, I mean, despite it being a really important body of work and contributions, there are, of course, a range of cautions and complications that come with post-colonial feminist interventions. And a lot of these critiques and cautions have come from within post-colonial feminists and their work. So, for instance, Spivak and Ray Chow have cautioned against the risk of developing romanticized attachments to this illusionary, authentic subaltern subject and her entirely uncontaminated, pure, transparent agency. So we're trying to then look for this pure subaltern who is never tainted by the colonial encounter and retrieve her lost true voice. And to Spivak, this is not only inherently impossible, but also a deeply problematic expedition or enterprise that you have to go in. And so they warn against this fetishization of the pure subaltern subject as whose agency you need to recover and amplify. In doing this, they also talk about the risk of post-colonial theorists, especially for those of us who are from the parts of the world that we study, we can often be read or interpolated as the native informant, right? As that who has that sort of unique domestic insight and knowledge and has access to objective local truths. So there's also the importance of resisting that reading of ourselves as native informants. And there's also another quite dangerous set of challenges that Spivak alerts us to, which is that quite often, again, for those of us who are writing about subaltern subjects, in a lot of ways, our work is parasitic on the continued silence of the subaltern subject, because it is only as long as they remain silent that we are able to be their representatives, that we are able to speak on their behalf. And this is particularly true for those of us who work within development, whether it is in scholarship or in practice on the field. This role of interlocutor, of mediator, is parasitic on the ongoing silence of the communities that we are working with and for. So we have to be really careful about making sure that, you know, those sort of perverse incentives don't come in the way of meaningfully redistributing resources and voice to subaltern subjects. And the third and final risk is particularly rife, and especially like in contexts like my own in India, where post-colonial theory is increasingly being appropriated and distorted to fetishize indigenities and uphold crude neonativisms. So it is now then a refusal of everything Western, which becomes a celebration of everything indigenous, including its violent patriarchies, including its inherent and internal racisms and violences. This is something that we see ongoing in India and Afghanistan and various parts of the world, where the repudiation of the Western has come at severe cost for various subjects, and especially for women. So I want us to now take another maybe 3-4 minutes to also discuss whether you've seen the emergence or strains of post-colonial feminisms in your context, how you think it might apply or might not to your work, what sorts of possibilities and challenges it implies for the work that you do in your context. And also feel free in those 5 minutes to use the loo, because this is the only break we're going to get. We'll have to power through for the next 40 minutes. So take about 5 minutes to discuss with those at your table, have a break, and then we'll be back in 5.
And why do you have all? Well, I do like no, I don't find that's another No, I saw your video.
Okay, shall we start up again? Okay, so we're going to now quickly spend about 10-15 minutes, before I forget the mic, on decolonial feminisms. Have any of you encountered decolonial feminisms before the reading for today? Or yeah, go ahead, Carla.
Oh, no, just studying in my travels in Central and in South America, which is where this school of thought was born. I just had some exposure to Maria.
Amazing, yeah, she's brilliant. Not always an easy read, but a very rewarding one when you sort of work through her work. And unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago. Yeah, quite young. It's really sad, but she has made incredible contributions to the field. And in the years leading up to her death, there have been a series of journals that have special issues dedicated to thinking about decolonial feminisms and its implications for various parts of the world, I think, including science. So that's a special issue worth looking up. So just to quickly locate decolonial feminism within decolonial theory and the notion of the coloniality of power, decolonial theory emerged from what is in some ways sometimes called the modernity/coloniality school, which saw coloniality as the dark side of modernity. And this is, as we've heard from Carla and before, something that emerged especially within South and Latin Americas and now increasingly in North America. And it's emerged from the work of sociologists Anabel Quijano, Walter Mignolo, and Maria Lagunes, who you've read through Icaza and Vasquez for today. And so basically the major contribution of this school was in terms of this idea of modernity coloniality, which insists that capitalism is concomitant with colonialism. Capitalism is not sort of an autonomous system that was imported to the Americas from the West, but capitalism required the internal conditions of the colony in order to recognize itself within Europe. So decolonial theorists conceptualize colonialism as this dark side of modernity and suggest that slavery, forced labor, and the rightlessness of colonized people exist in a dialectic relationship to liberal notions of liberty, equality, justice, and freedom. Right? So all of the liberal notions that were being celebrated during Enlightenment in Europe were only made possible through the occupation and suppression of land and life within the colony in the Americas. So to them, the colony is the condition of possibility and the proving ground of the Western nation state. And the rights-bearing citizenship of men within the West emerged only because, or was only made possible because of the occupation of the Americas. So it was precisely because of the subordination of others and the fact that freedom is parasitic on subordination, that decolonization also becomes a forever unfinished project and an ongoing process. So although colonialism in some ways has ended in parts of the world, according to the school, the coloniality of power continues to define relations between the West and the rest. Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano is really the one who coined this coloniality modernity term, and most importantly pointed to how racialization was a process that was integral to colonialism. So beginning with the conquest of the Americas in 1492, European conquistadors proclaimed themselves lords of the world and the natural rulers of inferior peoples. And the rationality with which they did that was purely race-based, right? So they used conquest as proof of their superiority. The fact that we've arrived here and taken over your lands must mean that there is something superior about us. And then went on to reclassify populations in accordance with hierarchies of race. And so those who were conquered through violence were condemned to a zone of non-being. They were stripped of humanity, rights, and self-determination. And it was through the importing of race as a logic that occupation was cemented and justified and rationalized. And this is something we've already been talking about for a while today. But it was in the Americas really that this linking of biological and cultural inferiority was cemented as a logic, that racial inferiority came to stand in for broader cultural and intellectual inferiority. According to Aníbal Quijano, race rendered all aspects of indigenous life, including sex, labor, collective authority, subjectivity, and intersubjectivity, subject to these sort of hierarchical controls. So it was race that designated who would be a slave, who would be an indentured laborer, who was a free wage laborer, and who, in fact, was the beneficiary of all of this labor. So race determined political status and was a foundational sorting logic and order. And at the same time, of course, European knowledge production was accredited as the only valid form of knowledge, and indigenous epistemologies were given the status of primitive superstition and were quite often expressly destroyed. So again, much like within post-colonial traditions, colonialism is not seen as a historical artifact or an ancient relic, but coloniality, which they distinguish from colonialism, refers to a long-standing pattern of power that emerged in the context of colonialism, which redefined and continues to redefine culture, labor, intersubjective relations, aspirations of the self, notions of common sense, and knowledge production, all in ways that accredited the colonizer at the cost of the colonized, right? And within decolonial theory, there's also a study and evidence of the silence and eradication of non-Western knowledges. So what Spivak has called epistemicide, Eduardo Landert has called the coloniality of knowledge, which is, the diverse practices by which non-Western knowledge has been absolutely eviscerated systematically. Now, coming from this broader school of decolonial theory and the tradition of modernity coloniality, seeing coloniality as the dark side of modernity, comes Lagunes's work on the coloniality of gender. She draws on Quijano's work and his important intervention around race, but says that Quijano does not actually attend critically enough to the question of gender and takes that as a given, as it's sort of taken for granted. To Lagunes, what she says is that rather than considering gender a sort of perennial or inevitable feature of social organization, she understands gender as a colonial construct, just like race was. It was something that was constructed and imposed during occupation. So again, think back to thinking of both race and gender not as innocent categories of classification or categorization, but racialization and gendering instead as ongoing processes that were central to the cementing of colonial relations. We'll talk about Lagunes's work again in a little bit more detail in our seminars, but what's quite important is that what Lugones saw as important was identifying and diagnosing the workings of coloniality in the production and reproduction of race and gender, and saw as a solution to some of this freeing subjugated knowledges and indigenous cosmologies. So to her, a decolonial feminism looks at excavating forms of knowledge that sat at that colonial encounter and have been eviscerated since. And that's where the possibility of liberation lies. In Lugones's work, again, what an important distinction she makes is in who is actually attributed gender versus sex, right? So to her, the ways in which gender was attributed within Europe was very different from how gender was attributed in the colony. Because in Europe, people were men and women. In the colony, they were not even human. So they were males and females. They were sex. There was biological variation between them. But they were not given the social accord of being a man or a woman. And so this is a crucial distinction that Lugones makes. And it's a similar distinction that a lot of Black feminist theorists like Horton Spillers has made, which is how Black women in particular were sexed but ungendered. They were not allowed or were not allowed access to the category of woman because, for instance, sexual violence against Black women or enslaved women was never recognized. So they were withheld recognition as a woman because a woman can be violated, and a Black woman was not seen as a subject capable of being violated. So in so many ways, the category of woman itself was withheld from colonized and enslaved subjects through processes of simultaneous racialization and gendering. So here Lugones is showing how we cannot think of gender outside of race, because the way in which gender is attributed to the white European subject is very distinct from the way gendering is done to the occupied subjects. So we're going to again think a little bit about how Lugones's sort of challenge to us is to constantly identify and challenge the workings of the coloniality of power, to constantly map the ways in which gender and race are reproduced through forms of knowledge while recovering subjugated knowledges and indigenous, what she calls indigenous cosmologies. Cosmologies are epistemologies or ways of knowing and being in the world. Now, again, much like post-colonial feminism, decolonial feminisms also hold tremendous analytical and political value, but they also confront their own challenges and critiques. So Julieta Paredes advanced a critique of Lugones's concept of the coloniality of gender, suggesting that this also to an extent misses the centrality of gender as a central sorting logic in indigenous societies prior to European colonization. So this is, you see, a critique that is common to both. We do not want to fetishize the indigenous. We do not want to uncritically think that whatever came before was in some ways ideal and perfect and needs to be retrieved in exactly that form. Another important challenge that's confronting the ways in which decolonial theory is increasingly circulating is that decolonization has increasingly just become an empty signifier, just a metaphor for a whole range of social justice projects which no longer link to the actual material decolonization that people were struggling for when these terms and struggles came into fruition. So Eve Tuck and Yang, for instance, are quite disturbed by the purely epistemic and discursive turn of decolonial theory, that suddenly we seem to only be interested in language and discourse and forms of knowledges, when we forget that actually decolonization is first and foremost a struggle for the repatriation of land and lives. This is what has been occupied. It is a material relation of domination. And that is what we need to return to fighting for. So they take issue with the easy ways in which decolonization has been taken up as a slogan for, like, we decolonize our classrooms, our curriculum, our banks, our marketplace, our absolutely everything. Forgetting that actually it is a struggle for fundamentally the repatriation of land and life, which in various contexts continues to be occupied. And so they think that when you make decolonization this sort of empty metaphor that is circulating in so many spaces and stands to mean so many different things, it makes possible a set of evasions, or what they call settler moves to innocence, because you can be claiming to be decolonial within what are inherently violent institutions that reproduce and uphold the coloniality of knowledge and also of material relations. in various ways. So they insist on attending to questions of the material. Um, and finally, Bolivian indigenous scholar Silvia Rivera Cusicanchi has cautioned against the ways in which, in some ways, decolonial theory has also been taken up a bit too enthusiastically within the Western academy. Increasingly, it's an area of thought that a lot of spaces are very eager to take up and to claim, and to an extent, it's even been canonized in ways that we need to be quite suspicious of. And this is also done in ways that continue to marginalize, especially indigenous language knowledges in Latin America. Non-Spanish language forms of knowledge and knowledge production and circulation. Okay, so if you've taken a moment, I think, to discuss some post-colonial feminisms in your context, do any of you want to feedback from your previous discussion or think through decolonial feminisms, whether you've seen or heard things of this nature in the context in which you work, if you think that they might be applicable or not? Any quick?
Can talk from Portugal.
Please do.
So there's a very interesting project about decolonizing the school curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
So as I've talked before in some of the seminars in Portugal, like it's the way that colonialism is taught in schools is in a very positive way, let's say. So it's about talking about this golden area of Portugal, and I think there's a very strong resistance from people in general and the government in particular to let go of this golden area, as they say, because before Portugal was quite important within Europe, and it's not anymore. So if people let go of this power, so what's Portugal? What's the identity of Portugal, right? So there's very interesting movements now about decolonizing the school curriculum, and also about decolonizing the culture, in a sense. I've talked before in some of the seminars. So if you go to Lisbon, you would see lots of monuments really emphasizing the positive sides of the colonialism. So it's about discovery. That's the word, right? It's not invasion, it's discovery. And it's really, And I'm not sure if it was already approved, but it was one particular museum. It was like an open museum with human figures to call attention to slavery. And people were really getting struggled to have that monument approved by the government. So it's very, very these movements that are trying to reshape the history and talk about what actually happened are really facing strong resistance from the government.
And I suppose that's the case, including in this country and various other parts where there is, and that's precisely the sort of settler move to innocence or colonial amnesia, colonial aphasia. There's refusals to remember and memorialize those elements of colonialism, the less pleasant or palatable truths of what happened in that area. Anyone else? Any reflections on? Yeah, go ahead.
Just a small example. I think now it's really clear that this movement should be existed in Russia because of the war, because the government sent soldiers only from ethnic minority groups. Now the colonial feminists, they kind of received the credit that they were right. You see how it works, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about, in terms of what sort of credit with the decolonial feminists?
I mean, they started the discussion about the decolonization of Russia like a long time ago, and nobody was hearing it. Yes. But now it's so obviously clear that they were right. Yes.
So are they gaining popularity again?
I think yes, especially from the post-Soviet Union countries.
Yeah. Amazing. It would be really great to read some literature on decolonial feminisms from post-Soviet. So if you have any recommendations, please post them to Canvas. That would be fascinating. Yeah. Go ahead.
So, I think maybe nurturing, say, an anti-colonial feminist approach maybe starts at education and social development, I guess. So as much as the colonizer countries need to reckon with their history, I feel like even in colonized countries, like our histories don't really tell you what the colonizers were responsible for. Like, oh, we were colonized by the Portuguese from X to Y, Dutch X to Y, British X to Y, and then like some vague mentions of a rebellion that
say, very soft language. So we talk about like actual, like say the plantation industry. So the way resistances were
squashed. Yeah.
For lack of a better word, still a very polite word, I think.
Yeah.
That is never there, right? So then you do get this group of people who have this weird colonial hangover, essentially. But the roads and the trains and the language,
infrastructure.
Yeah. So I feel like for like a real, like a proper like anti-colonial, decolonial reckoning, maybe even like on the colonizers and colonized communities, and you do need a real like deep history as to here's what they actually did to you before you start romanticizing and kind of letting stuff go.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the big challenges of that is that there's also no real reckoning with the unevenness of the effects of colonialism on the occupied populations, right? Because as we were discussing earlier, because we watched a clip from Suella, occupied territories did not have an entirely homogeneous experience of occupation. And an honest reckoning with that is absolutely crucial. And what's also difficult is that so often post-colonial contexts are increasingly also colonizing contexts, either within their territories or beyond them. And all that they remember from the sort of post-colonial legacy is how they came together as a nation to fight with the imperialists. While erasing again the violences within them, the hierarchies within them, caste in India, the ongoing occupation of indigenous people, the Adivasi lands, etc. All of these are huge issues and remain issues, clashes within ethnic communities and indigenous communities in so many parts of the world. And so a decolonial feminism has to, again, persistently identify and take issue with each of these forms of constitutive hierarchies. Any final reflections, or should we move on to the third and final section? Go ahead, Carla.
Sure, on how the colonial language is often used to continue to dominate certain settings, like in France, the former French colonies, the kind of equivalent of the Commonwealth is la francophonie, which is all the countries that still speak French, and they provide, they being the French, provide free French language school curriculums and stuff to discourage countries like Senegal or Mali from using their own curriculums in Wolof or other national languages, for example. So they would have to invest their own money in that, and they don't want to get kicked out of the francophonie because then they don't get to attend the fancy conferences and get $8 and things like that. So the sort of clinging, exactly like you said, clinging to the time when French was actually the lingua franca and it wasn't English. The French were very attached to that and do not want to accept that that's no longer the case. And the main way that they exert power over their former colonies at this point is
linguistic,
sort of linguistic alliance, being we have this thing in common that we all speak the same language. Why do we speak the same language?
We didn't always.
Right, and it also gets back to your point about the hierarchies within the colonization. So in Senegal, which is the context I'm most familiar with, the more you have gone to school, the more privilege you've had to be able to access education, the better your French is, so the more you're able to access the resources from that francophonie. So there's also that sort of.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of linguistic supremacy is an incredibly important point. And the irony of the fact that, for instance, in most of the Commonwealth now, English has become the primary medium of instruction from the primary level. And yet, when any of us want to come to the UK, we have to give a test for English as a foreign language and pay a lot. Yeah, every 2 years. Yeah. It's so good. Yeah, you speak so well. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You'll have to do it again. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So in our last sort of 10 odd minutes, I want to quickly cover a final category, and this is this notion of Southern feminism is a very broad and in quite a few ways nebulous collection of interventions, and the term is itself quite controversial because there's little consensus around what actually constitutes Southern feminisms. But at its broadest, I suppose they emerged in response to mainstream liberal analysis that underwrote a lot of thinking and interventions. They have quite a bit in common with the anti-colonial feminisms we've seen so far, and they emphasize the importance of location and of critically interrogating the relationship between the global North and global South. So they asked us to attend to important questions around who sets the development agenda, and also paying attention to structural inequalities in the global system while talking about gender inequality. So rather than simply looking at a sort of gender equality index and showing how it is terrible in this part of the world and wonderful in another, it asks that we attend to structural inequalities within the larger global system before we pretend that these comparisons can be fairly made. They also took issue with homogenizing women as a category, and similar to anti-colonial feminisms and what we heard with Mohanty, took issue with this idea of global sisterhood and the notion that patriarchy in some way affects all women differently located across the globe in a uniform manner. They also took interest in especially third world women's triple role or burden, and located them distinctly to women within the West and the ways in which they were incorporated, for instance, into the market system, or the ways in which state support was available for them to help with caring and other social reproductive functions. They also took issue with a lot of the tools and interventions that were central to the development industry. Assumptions around women's time, labor, control of resources, and how all of this played out against the backdrop of especially structural adjustment policies. So a lot of this also emerged from the dependency school theory, which we read about and heard about from Laila's lecture back in week 1. They also demanded that, for instance, women in development, as a framework, thought about questions and concerns beyond pure economics and agriculture and the ways in which women can be incorporated within productive systems, and insisted that there be an equal emphasis on questions of rights and politics. So the 1980s saw a blossoming of a lot of transnational Southern feminist networks such as Dawn, WLMUL, AWORD, etc. So these were all these networks of women who were quite insistent on forming South-South women partnerships. And they tried to capture development spaces and conversations and challenge the traditional wisdom of things like special economic zones, of course, structural adjustment, trade as smart economics, as well as dominant health and population control policies, because this was also something that women in the global South were disproportionately exposed to. The burden of population control and of averting, environmental degradation and climate change fell again on women from the third world. So now coming from, this whole family of anti-colonial feminisms and Southern feminisms, to the question of what does this mean for development? Why should we think of colonialism and development alongside each other? If you think back to the first week with Laila, we heard how many scholars, especially from the post-development school in Latin America, saw development itself as a relentlessly and irredeemably colonial enterprise. Development is precisely imperialism in new garb, according to a lot of these authors. So development reproduces forms of knowledge in which it embeds itself and produces a sort of system of power that is marked by global hierarchies and inequalities. So development also then fosters particular types of subjectivities through which people come to see themselves as either developed or underdeveloped, as capable of development or for development. And in all of this, the third world is produced as the imaginative geography for development. And of course, as we know, this is in no way an objective or uncontested or innocent geographical categorization. It's a political categorization that constructs and assigns relations of superiority, backwardness, much like what we've seen in the colonial era. So development is very much a practice that continues the logics of imperialism and occupation. So as Arturo Escobar writes, the third world has been produced by the discourses and practices of development since their inception in the early post-World War II period. From this time, reality has been colonized by the development discourse, and those who were dissatisfied with the state of affairs had to struggle for bits and pieces of freedom within it, in the hope that in the process, a different reality might one day be constructed. And so this is while the post-development school imagined development as a whole as a colonizing practice, Spivak and others have also seen GAD or WID and WAD, these particular practices of women in development or gender and development, as also colonial enterprises or having complicity with colonialism. So as Spivak writes, and this is from her book, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, she says, WID discursively colonizes the material and historical heterogeneities of the lives of women in the third world. It produces the image of an average third world woman as an object of development. Third world women only become subjects when supplemented by the rationality or idea of development, which recodes imperialism's civilizing mission as the genteel or much more palatable gender and development. So we have to also be really careful to the ways in which gender and development can be complicit within colonial continuities. A final sort of recent post-colonial feminist interrogation has been the shift of the image of third world woman as victim to third world woman as authentic heroine. And this is something that we've spoken about previously in some of our seminars, and we'll look at in today's seminar as well. So Kalpana Wilson, for instance, has shown how increasingly, and especially over the past 2 decades, the image of this victim figure that we've been reading about from Mohanty and others has been displaced with third world woman as a heroine of development. So here, gender and development programs represent her as this unencumbered entrepreneurial subject, right? And there's a co-optation of the language, of the feminist language of empowerment, which should be about collective struggle over public resources. But empowerment then actually becomes about private or individual striving through active participation, especially in market relations, for instance, through microcredit schemes, etc. So then now women are positioned as responsible for their own poverty. So they become managers of their own poverty rather than victims or located within a structure that leaves them with few alternatives. So the solution that we can see is much more complicated than just displacing the victim narrative, because when you displace it, it's often then replaced by a narrative that makes women complicit in or responsible for their own suffering in a way that is also terribly dangerous to gender and development programming. So the solution can't be to simply displace the abject victim with the heroic agent. Both of these are representational realities that we need to mediate carefully between. So all this brings us to our final set of reflections in terms of, well, what do we do then? What do anti-colonial and Southern feminisms taken together tell us about how we can perhaps more responsibly and ethically approach the problems of gender and development? Some of the overall learnings are to persistently challenge universalisms, to insistently particularize and historicize. Ask, where are you speaking from? Who are you speaking for? What are you speaking to? Against the backdrop of what histories see gender and race not as innocent categories of classification, but racialization and gendering as ongoing processes and political projects. Simultaneously, we need to refuse neonatalisms, not fetishize indigeneities and ethno-nationalisms that they celebrate, and to constantly think really carefully about the question of representation. Who are we speaking for? Do we have the authority to? In what capacity? Are we speaking over them? And the Vietnamese author Trinh has a really nice way of putting it, where she says, I don't intend to speak about, just speak nearby, to speak alongside in solidarity with, perhaps to amplify the voices of those that you seek to work in community with. And so just to end, there's this quote by Spivak where she says, it seems to me, not be, to be that finding the subaltern is not so hard, but actually entering into a responsibility structure with the subaltern, with responses flowing both ways, not just you speaking for her or at her, but responses flowing both ways, learning to learn without this quick fix frenzy of doing good, with an implicit assumption of cultural supremacy, which is legitimized by unexamined romanticization. That is the hard part. So the hard part is really trying to understand how in each context that we work in, we can enter into a responsible, responsive reciprocal relationship with the subaltern subjects that we hope to work with. And how this actually looks and function in practice varies hugely from context to context, and it's something that we'll have to continue to pick apart in the sessions to come. But that is it for now and for today. So thank you so much. Thank you for doing the 3 readings for this week. Hopefully they were more enjoyable than tedious. They are a bit challenging, but we'll work through them in detail in the seminars. And so I will see you all in a few hours. Thank you.
Can I email you a PDF?
Yes, whatever you prefer.
Okay, I'll send it to you.
Whatever.
Is it okay if it's like 1 or 1:30-ish?
No problem. Whenever. No problem.
I have my presentation next week. So I was just wondering, like, how do I get in touch with Liza? Because she's the most, and then I think she doesn't come to IDS, like, except Tuesdays. But I mean, otherwise she'll meet you on that. Okay, so I'll tell Niharika and Alice.
Yeah, you, all of you, just one of you email will see the rest. Okay. Then you'll all be on the same thread, and she might just set up one time to talk to you.
Okay, thank you.
Happy Diwali! Happy Diwali!
Oh yeah, I was also back on Friday.
If they are both on the same level, I have to do No, it was too bad. She was also doing that.
I mean, it merged at once.
Yes.
I think we played a very important role in merging.
I agree. Yes, I'm very happy. I mean, I didn't know what to do. Thanks, right? I've been like, they're like, oh, we have questions. I'm like, oh, my colleague Sina is very, very well. Maybe you guys very well. You know what? Maybe you guys should do it together. Like, Hiba has the means. But if you don't understand all these dogs, you choose Sina. That's only for that could have happened to why do you one job. You are campus, right? I mean, there's nothing about some email. Are you in? This is what I'm gonna do to you. And I'll divert my calls. You're loving. And then they questions that you may have been about the concept. I don't know why do you think it I know I don't answer, but I read and I don't understand what they say. And I just have to speak it. So they don't think I'm speaking it. I mean, what is red? Red is red. Yeah, bigger one. You mean the ideas? Whenever I go, those people
You would not have, yeah.
They always send in some. And the general students go and like.
And you know, I'm thinking about
In the gender context.
yeah.
But did he have fun? I
Is there any kind of like
a house but not had any love yet.
Oh
really?
Oh yeah.
That's so funny.
They keep telling me how the child is.
Okay, they're trying again.
Accepting partners, like couples, but not a child. What if like me and my
They told me that they were accepting children. Not
Maybe you should pass that contact.
So many videos. She had any love because she has been around. Maybe she understands them.
Nobody reads their emails, so we have to have meetings about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm like, I highly recommend this voucher.
Because I'm doing the birthday party. Oh my god. Welcome. I think you yeah, I'm just going to part out.
Are you staying with us?
downstairs. You are in Brighton.
Yes. Just text me. Okay, I'll do it. Yeah. Oh, it's
We're gonna try to get through the next hour.
You get that in your couple, they don't like it.
No.
Did you say that you let me go? You quit and you will stay with me. Let me go.
I think because you can't say no.
Maybe couples.
So you guys enjoyed a lot?
I'm not dealing.
When you came back? Oh wow.
I'll ask those who have
Okay. Let's go.
Okay, also they listen to you.
You're also looking for a house?
So we will have Wednesday at 24. So I think we have
I'll go there.
which is 5 times.
And how much is it?
It's for Saturday. Like not even.
Okay, he's also traveling from Wessex. Yeah, she's traveling from Kent.
Kent is far.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really. So how long will it be? and there is a like social plan.
That's what he was. Like I was saying about the real part.
No,
I do 67.
I just started. No, wait, you're joking. What day?
A day. 67.
No, but
Have you ever seen me in Tuesday class? I can't remember.
Wait, do you have a real card?
Yeah, the real card.
Yeah.
I
Wait, I didn't sign mine off. What's this? Why is everyone
Maybe you're
having to
still
sign?
traveling.
I don't know.
No, but I get a discount. I didn't have to sign
So
anything.
you pay £30 for the real card.
Yes, I did everything online.
Then you get 30%. But I didn't know that.
So I think when you do it, just be very
You do have to sign anything. You got a physical card. Oh, maybe that's why. I just have a digital one. So maybe that's why I don't sign Maybe that's why you need to do the signing. Mine is just a digital one, and once I go online, it just is automatic. Get discount. No, if you have a real card, you have a 30% discount also.
Yeah.